The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody, and you are very welcome to today's webinar from Policy in Practice. Today's webinar is titled Track the Living Standards of Low-Income Households, and it's great to have you join us today. So today I'm just going to do a little bit of housekeeping just to get us started and just to allow a few more other people to join us. So just while I do that, for those of you who are already here, if I may direct you to the panel on the right hand side, and if you could carry out a little audio check for me, that would be great. In the panel you'll be able to see a little place where you can raise your digital hand. So if you could click that now, just so that I know that you could hear us all okay, and that would be perfect. And while you do that, if I may just also in that panel remind you that this is where you can ask your questions for today's speakers. So that's also in the panel on the right hand side. Thank you very much for everybody that's putting their hand up. So that's perfect. So just to let you know that we will have polls and a survey at the end of the webinar. So we're trying to make it interactive for you today. And we will aim to have you on your way by 11:30. Excellent, great, very good, thank you. So that prompts me then to let me show you who our speakers are today. So who we have today on the webinar, we have Devon Galani from Policy in Practice, Chris Buckman from Exeter City Council, and Taryn Matthew from Policy in Practice. Devon, would you like to say hello?
Hi everyone, thanks all for joining the webinar. We're looking forward to speaking with you today.
Thank you, Devon. Chris?
Hi, good morning everybody.
Excellent. And Taryn?
Hey everyone.
Excellent. Everybody's in good form and raring to go. So let me share with you the agenda and what we're going to be talking about today. It's quite a packed agenda. We've got a lot to get through. So hopefully we're going to be moving at pace. But don't worry, because there will be plenty of opportunity to pick up with us after the webinar if there's something that you want to go back on to. But what we're going to be covering today, we're going to be looking at the challenges in 2018 facing low-income households and local authorities. Exeter, Chris is going to talk to us about why Exeter is tracking the living standards of low-income households. And we're going to talk about some practical examples of how household level data can help with the challenges that this brings. There'll be plenty of time for discussion, and Taryn is going to give a demonstration of the dashboard that Exeter City Council is using, which turns the analysis into action. And then, like I say, questions and answers at the end. So that's very much what we're going to be talking about today. For those of you, just quickly before I hand over to Devon, for those of you who may not be familiar with Policy in Practice, thank you very much for joining us. It's great to see you here. Policy in Practice exists to make the welfare system simple to understand so that people can make informed decisions that are right for them. We have 3 services that we use to do this: our software, our analytics, and our modelling. And today we're going to be talking about the analytics. So that's just a brief introduction about who we are and what we do. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Devon, who's going to talk a little bit more about all of that. Over to you, Devon.
Great, thank you, Janet. And again, thanks again for everyone for joining. A big thank you to Chris Buckman from Exeter City Council for joining us today, who we've been working with for a number of months now. Chris, you've already said hello, but I wondered if you wanted to just say a little bit about, just so kind of when we move on to learning about how we've been working together, people know your role within the council and other bits and pieces. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I'm the Benefits and Welfare Lead at Exeter City Council, which means I'm responsible for the discretionary pots of funding, discretionary housing payments, exceptional hardship for council tax, and the local welfare support scheme, as well as leading on the council's preparation for the rollout of universal credit, which is coming to us in September this year. And also, I guess the other area where the data is really important to us is responsibility for setting the changes to the local council tax support scheme.
Great. Thanks, and again, I think that context really helps. There'll be lots of people from different departments on the webinar, so they know a bit about the context with which you're speaking there. I wanted to kick off and set the wider national context for why Policy in Practice thought it was important to be helping local authorities with this. As Janet said, we work in three broad areas we're policy experts by nature. We developed a piece of software that models how government policy, particularly those policies that affect low-income households, interact with one another. And the analytics allows us to run that analysis on individual households within local authorities. And I'll talk a bit more about that later. But the way in which some of that analysis has been used and some of the key findings that we found are covered really on this page. So we all know that 2018 onwards, in many ways, sort of the last 5 years and arguably before then, have been a very difficult time for low-income families in particular. What the analysis allows us to do is really identify which families are going to be hardest hit. This shows some coverage we got for a paper that we wrote with the local government association carrying out analysis on low-income households. What we found was that a combination of three things really: rising rents, rising living costs more generally, and cuts to welfare that are affecting specific households were having a very damaging effect on the ability and the resilience of low-income households. What the household level analysis allowed us to do is really identify those groups that were hardest hit and drill down perhaps more deeply than other analysis has allowed us to in the past. So some key headings. So there's an affordability crisis, especially in the private rented sector. What we found was that the average losses to low-income households in real terms, so when you factor in the cost of living, was around £40 per week. But some of those households that were hardest hit, for example, those in the private rented sector, so you can see the headline there, 2 million families were losing out much more than that. So while the average is being £40 worse off in real terms, some families are considerably harder hit. Some of the drivers of that are weaker work incentives and other cuts to benefits, which I'll talk about in a moment or two. And what it means for local authorities is that you've got a responsibility to protect your most vulnerable households, while at the same time you've got financial pressures and some of the challenges of getting those funds to the people that need it the most. And the conclusion, one of the conclusions when we did this national analysis was that the impact varies by region and for particular households within different regions. And there are some significant knock-on repercussions to other council services. And some of what we're working on with Exeter is the ability to drill that down even further to the impacts on individual households within Exeter. So it's a very difficult time for families. At the same time, it's a difficult challenge for all of you on this webinar in many respects, because you're all working on as practitioners with people on the front line, and as organisations, you're having to do support just as many, or in actual fact more people, with fewer and fewer resources or greater and greater pressure on those resources. So the background context: councils have seen cuts to funding, so a 40% cut in central government funding since 2010, with half of all councils expecting to see that funding disappear altogether by 2020-21. Chris, do you want to, where are Exeter on that scale?
I suppose we are maybe protected from some of the worst cuts. We're in a better position than some other authorities, but in common with everybody, we are seeing reductions to funding and pressure on the services we're delivering.
Yeah, and I can imagine some of the pressure that puts you guys under, which we'll dive into in a second. At the same time, demand seems to be going up. As I said, low-income households are seeing increased pressure. That makes it harder to collect council tax, harder to collect rent, harder for them to meet those obligations, and some of those repercussions might be their ability to sustain a tenancy, which can have knock-on impacts on families in terms of their ability to sustain a tenancy, which can also add to the financial pressure on councils. So it is important to try and act early to try and prevent some of the worst effects of these cuts from happening. Again, that wider context, there have been a whole host of reforms affecting low-income households. And it's important to remember that while some of these effects, for example, the benefit cap, while those have already come into effect, they are still in place, and new families are being affected by these reforms that are already in place on an ongoing basis. We've also got, this year in particular, the rollout of universal credit accelerating at pace. We've got responsibility responsibilities around the Homelessness Reduction Act, and all of these sets the wider context for why I think there are more and more councils that we're speaking with who want to be as informed and implement these big changes as intelligently as possible given their limited resources. This is a helpful download that, again, you can access through the panel on your right-hand side for all panelists, but this is some of the reforms that we can expect, so some of the changes to universal credit, including those that were announced previously and those that were announced in the budget more recently, which I think is a helpful download and helps set some of the context for the fact that these changes are going to be ongoing, and they do interact with one another. So, for example, increases in the national living wage might benefit some households who might otherwise be losing out due to cuts to the work allowance under universal credit, for example, and breaking out exactly which households are better off and which households are worse off does require that combined impact of understanding that combined impact of all of these reforms together. And then there's that ultimate need to protect the most vulnerable households. So we've got the Homelessness Reduction Act coming into force. 128,000 children in temporary accommodation, I think, in the Christmas just gone, and that's growing. The Act places a responsibility on councils to understand who's at risk, act earlier in terms of preventing homelessness, working with a broader cohort of households, not just those that are considered priority need, and developing an action plan for each one of those households. So that's actually for those councils, perhaps less so Exeter, but those councils that have taken on board the dashboard, that is one of the key uses that they're finding for it. In the context of universal credit, I'd love to understand, and we did a poll on this, was whether or not the budget changes were enough to try and stem some of those challenges. And I'd say the results were quite mixed. So about 10% thought they went, universal credit was back on track. 10% thought that it really wasn't enough, and about 80% thought, let's wait and see. So it's going to be interesting as we learn more and more from those full service authorities that we're working with, how that's happening. One of the ways in which we're doing that is giving councils the ability to identify and track those households that are on universal credit, which is something Taryn's going to talk about toward the end of the webinar. And then there are other changes too. So I wanted to touch on a few of these, and I could have picked any heading here, but the impact on disabled households, so particularly those in receipt of just the personal independence payment, or DLA, losing out as universal credit rolls out on premiums. There's also the implications of the work capability assessment and the impact that that's having. The work and health program is rolling out, potentially a very positive thing if it can be made to work effectively. But again, that involves knowing which households to help and helping them as effectively as possible, working together. And on the employment side, an ongoing focus on in-work poverty and helping people to progress who are already in work, but perhaps just about keeping their head above water. So Janet, did you want to run this? Let's ask the audience a question here and understand what some of the biggest challenges you face are before moving on to having a conversation with Chris about some of the challenges Exeter are facing and how they're tackling them.
Excellent, Devon. So hopefully, thank you. So hopefully what you can see on your screen now, as Devon says, is a poll where we're asking you, given all of this context, given all of this background, what is the one biggest challenge that you face? Now, I'm sure many of you might want to tick all 5 of those options, but we're asking you to select one. So please take a moment now and tell us your main challenge that you're facing this year. Is it tackling homelessness, supporting people as universal credit full service rolls out, spending your DHP money as effectively as you possibly can, helping people with employment, as Devon says, be that helping them into employment or indeed progress in work? Or is it managing arrears, for example, council tax arrears, housing benefit overpayments, rent arrears, that kind of thing? Thank you very much, everybody. I can see the votes coming in as I'm talking, so I'll just give you a little bit more time to cast your vote today. I do appreciate that it's a hard job to try to choose one of those 5. So thank you very much, everybody who is voting. Okay, I think I'll close the vote now. The vast majority of you have voted, so that's brilliant. Let me close that poll and then let me share the results on the screen. So from the top, So what is the biggest challenge you face? 35% of you say the biggest challenge is tackling homelessness. 38% say the biggest challenge is supporting people through universal credit rollout. 5% say spending your DHP money effectively. 5% say helping people into employment, and 16% say helping manage arrears. Sorry. So in terms of the biggest challenge, by a whisker, it's supporting people through universal credit at 38%, and closely followed by tackling homelessness. Devon and Chris, your comments on those poll answers.
Yeah, I mean, I think kind of, again, with that wider context, it'd be good for perhaps Terran can focus on these areas when we move on to the demonstration, but that entirely chimes with what we've been speaking to other local authorities about. I'm not sure, Chris, if there's anything there that surprises you or that perhaps affects Exeter in different ways.
I think the answer to that question is probably different for different people within the organisation as well. So depending who's on the webinar today, you get a different mix of answers, and also the priorities change day by day almost. So my focus this week is mostly on universal credit rollout, but over the next month or so, I'm going to be looking to make sure the DHP residual spend is focused effectively. So yeah, all of those kind of feed into the mix of challenging that authorities are facing.
Yeah, and I think that's, again, just a quick opportunity here to remind those panelists that you've got the ability to ask questions. So if there are specific questions you've got about those, either as Chris is speaking or as Terran's running through the demonstration, just type them in. Hopefully we'll have plenty of time at the end to go through some of those.
Lovely. And if not, if we don't have time to answer all the questions during the webinar, then I'll certainly make sure that we follow up afterwards. Excellent. Let me hide this poll now. Back to the presentation, Devon. Thank you.
Yeah, and I just thought I was looking through those poll options yesterday, and I think the overarching theme is helping local authorities, councils, understand who their most vulnerable residents are and how best to help them. So kind of almost regardless of what your challenge is, that's the question you should be asking yourself. Are you working with those that you should be? And are you our councils being as effective as possible in helping them, ideally toward greater independence? And if that isn't possible, then alleviating some of the challenges that they face. And the thing about supporting people toward greater independence is that can reduce demand further down the line. So that opportunity to be more proactive and preventative in your approach can be really powerful. So Chris, I wanted to give you the floor as early as possible in this webinar, and I've got a few broad questions, and do take as much time. I want to just emphasize that you are, from having run this webinar many times, when we have guest speakers from local authorities join us, you really are the star of the show. It's very helpful for people to understand that they're in that shared experience that they're having is shared by others, certainly. I thought I'd kick off with just a broad question, with maybe just telling the story of how you first came to know about policy and practice and the work that we do, and how the council itself went from being interested or intrigued to actually deciding to take the dashboard on. Yeah,
sure. I suppose the big motivator for us was that we were going through a restructure, and we were aware that we were going to be losing the officer who did most of our data modelling. We've always known that there's a lot of information available to us within the data we hold in the local authority, but we've never really felt like we're getting best use out of it. And we did want to be able to get a bit more insight into our caseload, which would enable us to target our resources better, and make sure that, as you said earlier on, that we're focusing on the customers that most need our help. The dashboard seemed like a way that we could get some added value into our data, so we weren't just looking at flat housing benefit information, but actually getting a bit of context to that as well. And obviously the very user-friendly dashboard was a way of doing that without lots of technical resources.
That's helpful, but it sort of makes me think of a question that I think we sometimes get asked when we're talking to councils that are perhaps interested and deciding perhaps a little bit on the fence about which way to go. So obviously with one of your analysts leaving the team, there's that choice of do we go ahead and move forward with policy and practice on the dashboard, or do we recruit another analyst who which is obviously an option. And I just wondered whether you could perhaps explain the thinking behind that and why you decided to go ahead with policy and practice in the dashboard.
I think the dashboard for us really, it gave us more information than we were able to just get out of our own data. There's an awful lot of additional fields and characteristics and so on that are added to the data that we send over to policy and practice every 3 months. When it comes back to us, it has all sorts of additional information that we wouldn't be able to necessarily model ourselves. So we're being told about customers who are have the largest cumulative effect of welfare reforms, but also looking forward to those who are going to be affected by reforms in the future, barriers to employment and financial resilience of households, all things which there's lots of clever stuff going on in the background, but I think even with an in-house analyst, we would struggle to add that level of richness to the data that we've got.
I think that's really helpful feedback for us, Chris. I think where some of that comes from is two areas. One is the modeling and analytical engine we place on top of your data. But the second one, I think, stems from the fact that we're working with a number of different councils on answering their questions. And through the dashboard, if we've answered one question, for example, for Cornwall Council, that's then that question can then be answered. You can use that same feature we've developed for Cornwall to answer questions yourself. And similarly, as we've been having conversations with you about your various use cases, that can help us to refine the information that's available for you that then benefits other councils too. So, I mean, perhaps the next big broad question: how are you using it? Can you dive into a couple of ways in which you've been using the dashboard?
Yeah, sure. Well, it's early days so far. We've had the dashboard since September, first lot of data in September. So we're kind of getting to grips with it now, and I guess I've been using it. The dashboard works on 3 levels for me. We've got the high level caseload data, so lots of useful information in there that has gone into reports for members and to senior management. It tells us what's going on in Exeter as a whole. Also a very useful ward level breakdown when we've had queries from individual ward councillors who want to know what's going on in their ward. So looking at big picture stuff, how many customers are going to be affected by universal credit, how many are going to be better or worse off under universal credit rollout. And then looking at a slightly smaller scale at the cohort level, breaking down the whole caseload into the characteristics of those people who are going to be affected by universal credit. So obviously, as a stockholding local authority, we're really interested in the impact on council tenants. So being able to look at that group of customers who are going to be facing an income shortfall under universal credit, going to be worse off under universal credit. How many of those customers have we already got rent arrears with? So we can start targeting them before we get to September, before rollout, and target them for recovery work, or looking at targeting our DHP spend better towards that group. And for those of us who like fiddling around with Excel spreadsheets and pivot tables and the like, having all those characteristics in an easily downloadable format to be able to play around and to get the numbers out is really helpful. But then at the bottom level, at a household level, we're using it with our caseworking officers, because although we know a lot about them anyway from our own information, being able to see that household within the dashboard gives an insight into other characteristics that might not jump out at you otherwise. So some things that are slightly less obvious about their financial resilience, their relative poverty, and the cumulative impacts of welfare reforms is really helpful for people who are working one-to-one and trying to come up with individual plans, either for recovery or looking at discretionary spend from one of the pots that are local welfare support and crisis support and so on. So it's working on different levels for me so far, but obviously there's a lot more in there as well.
I mean, that's very helpful, and just to play that back, I think. So I think what you're saying is the impact on getting some of the aggregate numbers at Exeter and at ward level. The ability to use it for specific use cases around universal credit was the one that you focused on here, and perhaps Owen can focus on that in his demonstration. And then to drill down even further to individual households. And it would be great to perhaps the next follow-on question is how do you hope to use that information in the future to improve service delivery? So Yeah, that's probably good follow-on question. So you're talking a bit about how you're using it now and its capabilities, but how you want to use that in the future to drive some of the results that Exeter are looking to achieve.
Yeah, I think the big strength of the dashboard, where we're maybe underusing it at the moment, is about doing the proactive work, and it's about identifying the customers that we want to target our proactive work on. So we tend to manage our discretionary housing payment budget reasonably well, which can mean that come this time of year we've got a pot of money that we're looking to spend, and we will be using the dashboard over the next couple of weeks to identify those customers where we can maybe have the biggest impact. And one of the things I'm really hoping to be able to measure through the dashboard is how effective we are in that DHP spend, and are we having the sort of outcomes that we think we're having when we make the awards. So the tracking over time ability to look back at the impact that an intervention's had is going to help us for next year when we're making decisions about how we allocate the budgets. And there's lots of other work planned around recovery as well, and helping people in the preparation for universal credit rollout. So, but it's about identifying the cohort, the groups of customers where we can have the biggest impact, I think.
Yeah, and I think that just to underline that point about, and then trying to track, and then having the ability to track the impact that you are actually having, so you can improve services in the future, is something that I'm personally very passionate about, and think hopefully again with that work with other local authorities, we can help to sort of again share some of that best practice as we learn about what the numbers are telling us about what's most effective in Exeter and in other councils too. One follow-on question from that about that proactive use of the data is in engaging residents. So it's a question we often get asked, and there are plenty of councils I think who have done analytics work who then but then actually using it to engage residents can be a bit of a challenge. I don't know whether you put much thought into that, Chris, or if you're finding that a challenge too.
Yeah, I think there's the two different kind of customer groups that we work with. There are those that come to us asking for something, that come in looking for crisis support or are struggling to maintain a payment arrangement, and we can generally engage with them quite well because they want something off us, and we can put conditions on that to get them to work with us and take other actions. When you come to the proactive stuff, where you're actually identifying customers that you think have a need and that should be working with you, they may be not as keen initially, but I think being able to have that insight into their household from the dashboard and the different characteristics that are identified in the dashboard, I think it does help the customer to see that you sort of understand what's going on in their background, in their household, and then you can add in that sort of using the discretionary funds to be able to get them to engage and making arrangements on payments. You pay £5 a week and we'll give you some discretionary housing payment, and if you can keep that up and maintain a regular payment plan, then we can clear your arrears sort of agreements where actually a small amount of discretionary spend can have a big impact.
Yeah, so that's showing what might be possible for them, because you know so much more about the household. That's showing what might be possible for them is could be a positive engaged residents.
It adds to the credibility, I think, when they're talking to a caseworker, that they actually understand what's going on with that customer, and it's not just about the numbers on the screen. But we can see that this has happened to you so far, but we've also got these things coming down the line that are going to impact you as well. So we need to prepare you and get you in a better situation.
Great. I mean, so let's kind of move on from talking about it to bringing it to life. I'll just take the opportunity again. Hopefully there are already some questions coming through, Janet, that you're picking up, but I just wanted to sort of remind the panel, if they've got any questions about how it can be used, both from what Chris has said and as Taryn runs through the demonstration, that would be really helpful. We'll cover, I think we've got plenty of time to cover a good chunk of those at the end. So I want to move on to bring to life how policy and practice is helping, and how the dashboard in particular, what that looks like. Before I sort of get into Taryn's demonstration, I thought I'd give a quick overview of how we do this. So what policy and practice does is we work with your data, so housing benefit data, council tax support data, all of the information we can get on your arrears and support payments, and put it all together around the household. So you've got one single view of what's going on with that household. We then link those data sets together over time so you can start to see the trend of households. So those that are perhaps starting to struggle more and more with their payments can be alerted or highlighted through a flag. So that's how we work with your data and perhaps help you to get more out of it, or alternatively kind of reduce the work that your analytical team would need to do in pulling it all together and making it usable and useful. How we then build upon that further is that we run for each household in that data set, and I think there's about 10,000 households in the Exeter data set. Terran?
Yeah, about 9,500 households. Yeah.
Yeah, Terran knows the numbers inside out, having crunched the data for Exeter. But for each one of those 9,500 households, we're running over 2,000 calculations on each household, which we then filter back to try and identify flags. So this is a household that, when they move on to universal credit, might be better off by £15.12 versus their neighbour, who might be worse off by £12.22. And then we're factoring in all of those reforms together on those households, both now and, as Chris mentioned, into the future, all the way through to 2020 and beyond. So the problem that solves is being able to understand, if you've got an intervention locally, you can understand the impact that they've had from, say, other national reforms, and therefore a little bit more about how to help them. What that allows you to do, to kind of roll back to Chris's response earlier, is to identify trends again at the aggregate or at the ward level, but then drill down further to pinpoint support to individual households, not just who to help, but also perhaps how best to help them. So which households, if you've got an employment support initiative, they're a lone parent, with young children, perhaps childcare might be a helpful approach to help them with making sure that they're aware of, say, the 3 to 4 year old childcare offer, or they might qualify for the 2-year free childcare offer, for example. And then the ability to track the outcomes over time. So if you've been working on, say, helping people to sustain tenancies, how successful have those interventions been? And I know that there are a lot of councils who are thinking about that as part of the Homelessness Reduction Act as well. So being able to act preventatively, but also show that prevention is having a positive impact and delivering savings. So to help you to make those better decisions that are strategic and at an operational level. And some of the benefits, to reiterate some of that, is that you've got all of your data all in one place as a data store in a downloadable format. It's your data. We don't hang on to it. You can just, if you want to do your own stuff with it, then you can go ahead and do that. We're modeling all of those policy impacts that you saw in those slides earlier, both the historical ones and the future ones around universal credit, and that's changing again as in the next budget, or if there were further changes to model, we would do that too. It's not just policy changes as well. We also factor in things like increases in the cost of living, the likely expenditure of individual households based on other benchmarks that we're able to access. Then I think a really powerful part of the dashboard, as opposed to perhaps our other earlier impact assessment services that many of you on the webinar may know us for, is that ability to track causality. So let's say Chris is allocating discretionary housing payments with the aim of helping someone into employment, and those are the conditions that have been placed on that household. The ability to see whether or not they then went on into employment and then sustain that employment onwards, and being able to do that at scale, particularly some of the larger local authorities, being able to track the overall effectiveness for managers of the services that they're commissioning is a bit of a challenge. And that's not just council services as well. That can also be looking at commission services, if you can record, for example, the housing benefit reference numbers of the households that are impacted. And then I think the fourth area that's, I think, particularly powerful is benchmarking. So we haven't really spoken to Chris about this much yet, but for example, as more and more clients come on board to use the dashboard, we've got the ability to see in aggregate who's affected how much where, and perhaps how Exeter fits in amongst its family of neighbouring local authorities or other local authorities that might seek to compare itself against. One of the reasons I was so keen to have Chris on the call is we've done various webinars on this and they've been a little bit London-centric. And actually, we know that the impacts of welfare reform in London are quite different, and the drivers of what's causing challenges are very different to what's happening in Cornwall or Exeter or even Newcastle or Durham, for example. And then the end result is that with the modelling engine on top, typically when councils look at this, they look at the impact of one policy. So universal credit's rolling out in my area is going to affect this many households, which is certainly one approach. But I think a better approach is to look at, okay, from the residents' perspective, they're going to see the impacts of universal credit, changes to the living wage, changes to benefits for 18 to 21-year-olds, for example, for non-dependents living in their household. All of these combined, what is the impact on the household? And therefore, how does that help us to engage that household? Because we know so much more about it. I know, Janet, one of the things with your marketing hat on you sometimes say is, you know, if you're trying to engage people, saying that we knowing more about them always helps you to engage them more. And sometimes you can use that information in a positive way to create that positive engagement. So those are some of the benefits of our approach. I'm going to hand over to Terran to talk through a couple of use cases. Terran, again, I didn't give you much time to introduce yourself at the start, sure, yeah. But perhaps you want to kick off there and then I'll slide across to the...
Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Terran Matthew. I'm a technical analyst here at Policy in Practice. I've been leading on the development of the low-income family tracking dashboard, which we will be demoing today. It was really great to hear, Chris, on how you've been using the dashboard and how you plan on using the dashboard as well. And for this demo today, we'll be using a fully anonymized version of Exeter's dashboard. As we were talking about, just going to give it a second to load here. As we were talking about universal credit, I thought the first thing I would like to show you was our impact of welfare reform dashboard screen. In this dashboard screen, we look at the impacts of different welfare reforms, including universal credit, and how they affect a household cumulatively, both now and in the future. And here you can see we have this overview screen that gives you these key highlights, and you can see immediately that there are 681 households highly impacted by welfare reform. So this is a combination of reforms which include the LHA cap, the bedroom tax, to name a few. Looking specifically at universal credit, you can see that there are 2,500 households that would be better off under universal credit, and about the same number of households that would be worse off under universal credit and would need transitional protection if they were to move over to universal credit. So you have these key numbers as an overview right before you drill down into the detail. Going into the next screen, you have the impact of welfare reform by ward. So at your fingertips, you have these numbers of the households impacted, the children affected, and the households in temporary accommodation. You have these numbers for the cumulative impact as well as different reforms as well. These you can then use this to communicate this information to your members, or you could use this to geographically drill down and develop localized support plans. But I'm just going to go straight into our street level view, where we'll be looking at all of Exeter's 9,400 households. And what this screen lets you do is it lets you slice and dice this data depending on what you're trying to achieve, your council's strategic priorities. So with regards to universal credit, using these filters on the left-hand side on reforms, I can look at those households that would be worse off under universal credit. So again, around those 2,500 households that we saw earlier. Further, I can layer on the impacts of other welfare reforms. So let's also look at those that would be high or medium impacted by welfare reforms right now. So they're being covered by other welfare reforms, not just the fact that they're worse off on universal credit. So you can see that it's about 500 households. And Chris had mentioned also you can then further drill down to those that are council tenants. So I'm just going to uncheck a few other tenant types. So we're looking at mostly council tenants. So here we have 166 households that would be worse off under universal credit if they are to move. They're also impacted by other reforms right now, and you can use this information. You can use this information to inform your universal credit rollout strategies. Additionally, if you hover over a household, you have this quick picture of what's going on in the household, including the support that they're receiving. So this particular household was receiving some support, some DHP, arrears balance, and you have this information for a quick picture. Further on universal credit, we've been working with some of our other full service clients. If I could go back to the presentation there. We've been working with some of our other full service clients. This particular dashboard is that of Croydon, and we've been able to capture their the households currently on universal credit. We've been able to do this through their council tax support data set. So here we can see that we've captured about 50% of their UC caseload, and we've been working with them, looking at the financial resilience of these households, and also helping them improve the take-up of council tax support within their universal credit claimants.
A good example of benchmarking here is we're working with a couple of local authorities that are also universal credit full service sites, and Croydon has by far the highest proportion that are claiming council tax support. So that's helped to give those other local authorities a benchmark and an impetus to try and focus on increasing the take-up of that support, both to improve the outcomes for the households, reduce bad debt and the level of arrears that they might need to collect from those households, but also increase and improve their visibility of households on universal credit, which otherwise they might lose.
Yes, definitely. Thanks, Devin. I wanted to switch gears for a second and now talk about homelessness.
Sorry, Terence, before you do that, if I may just jump in, because I think it might be an opportune moment to have a question that's come here. Is there any difficulty in using personal data in this way? I know that you're actually showing data here with HB reference numbers on it. Do you just want to make that point?
Sure. So the data sets that we receive from councils are redacted. So the identifiable information that we have are HB reference numbers. For the purposes of this demo, we've actually anonymized those HB references numbers further. But the identifiable information we would hold from the council are just the HB reference numbers, in addition to their household's date of birth and their postcode, which we need for an accurate benefit calculation.
So just to kind of emphasize the point that policy and practice has access to anonymized information on these households to carry out our analysis. But what the councils can then do when we give them this data set back is map that back to the personally identifiable information to carry out their own operational analysis. So we take your data anonymized, run it through our analytical engine, and play that back to you. And just to emphasize again here in this demonstration, the information here is entirely anonymized, although Chris has access to the real data.
The real data. Does that answer your question, Jen?
Yes, thank you. That's perfect. Thank you.
Thanks. On homelessness, what I wanted to show you was our household finances dashboard. And here in this dashboard, we look at the income of these households and we compare it with their modeled expenditure. What we then do is we segment households into those households that are coping, those that are struggling, at risk and in crisis. And those households that are at risk and in crisis are those households where their income does not even meet their expenditure. Specifically for the in crisis households where their income does not even cover their housing costs. So here in Exeter, we have 1,100 households that are at risk financially, so their income does not meet their expenditure. We have 18 households that cannot make their rent. But what the dashboard does for us is it combines these two numbers and layers on an additional data set, which is rent arrears. So immediately you can see there are 105 households with a cash shortfall and in rent arrears. So I'm going to click straight into that to look at these households further. So now from the 9,500 households, you're looking directly at these 105 households that are either at risk and in crisis and in arrears. So what would be interesting is to look at those that are currently not receiving a DHP. How many of these households do you think are receiving a DHP?
It's worthwhile just putting some thought. Typically, when we put this to local authorities, because we've already drilled down to those very high need households, they're in arrears, they're at risk and in crisis, you'd expect quite a high proportion of these to be receiving DHPs. On the whole, that isn't actually the case. Do you want to click in?
So let's see. So from the 105 households up there, you can see that the numbers lowered down to 101. So 4 households were known to Exeter and were receiving DHP support. But what we've been able to do here is, with a few button clicks, we have filtered out these 100 other households that are possibly eligible for a DHP and are at risk of homelessness. Again, if you were to target support, you can hover over a household to get a quick picture. But what you can also do is drill down to that household for a detailed picture.
So again, this shows how Chris might go on to operationalize some of this. So actually use the data set to, I think Chris, you mentioned once you're done with universal credit, you're going to look at how your discretionary housing pot has been spent. So this is trying to bring that use case to life.
Yeah. So here on this single screen, you're looking at demographic information about the household. You have a couple that's in work. You also have information about the household's financial situation, the income, the expenditure. You can see that the expenditure is higher than the income, which is why we've classified them as an at-risk household. This particular household has also is quite high level of rent arrears. You have additional information here on the support that they're receiving. This particular household is receiving council tax support. Down here, we have information about impacts of welfare reform. This household is facing a high impact, mainly due to the bedroom tax. And you have details about the employability. This household is in work and therefore has also low barriers to work.
But it might be a case to, again, help them with progression, for example.
And a feature that we are currently working on is connecting this information with a button click to our benefit and budgeting calculator. So the ability to load up this data, within our benefit and budgeting calculator, so that this can be used by advisors and explained and understood by residents. So what we have here is all that information pre-filled, a couple, the date of birth, and it gives you an idea of their current income and their income after costs. You can flick through to some of the tabs. I'll let Devin show this a little bit.
Yeah, I think the 2 points I wanted to just emphasize here is one, the time saving from having this already pre-filled, and then the ability to both use it as an engagement tool. So to answer that question that was raised earlier about how to use bring the analytics to life for the customer. So all of this is being done in real time, live. It could be done on an iPad going out to customers. And then it also generates a whole bunch of useful information to actually help that customer engage. So you could knock on their door and say, hey, did you know you might be eligible for a warm home discount? Well, but that could save you X pounds, which again just helps with that engagement process.
Thanks, Devin. I think the final thing that I wanted to talk about was the tracking of households, and this was a tool that we built so that we could track the changing circumstances of low-income households. I'm going to give it a second to load here. But what you will basically see is how we've tracked the cohort of households between the period of June to September. We've done analysis for Exeter at 2 points, and we're continuing to do that on an ongoing basis. So we have about 10,000 households within this time period, and we're looking at them at June, and then 4 months on, how has their tenor status changed. So right now we're looking at it by tenor. You have the ability to change this to look at different dimensions such as financial resilience, debt, economic status. But just taking a second to explain what's going on here. So this is a Sankey diagram that shows the flow of households over time. So just a quick example here, one of the bigger ones is there were 2,700 households that were council tenants in June and remained council tenants in September. If you were to use this tool to track the effectiveness of interventions, so for example at DHP, it's as simple as clicking this button here, so where it would filter out, and we would be looking at those households that have received a DHP. So you can immediately see that those 10,000 households have filtered down to this 178 households that have received a DHP, and you can see if your DHP is meeting your desired outcomes. Additionally, if you wanted, you could paste in HV reference numbers. So, for example, the 100 households that we had identified earlier being at risk of homelessness, you could very easily just paste those 100 reference numbers in here, and you would be seeing this Sankey diagram redrawn for those 100 households. But talking about tackling the risk of homelessness and understanding the drivers for homelessness, we can further use this diagram and interact with it to look at let's look at the households that have ended up in temporary accommodation. So I'm just going to keep only those households. So here from the 10,000 households, you can see that 218 households have ended up in temporary accommodation. Some of these households, about 70% of them, were already in temporary accommodation in June. But what's interesting is that you can see these flows from the different tenure types. Most noticeably, you can see these households that were not in the data set and immediately joined as those that are in temporary accommodation. So what this lets you do is the tool lets you then profile these households, and that can then inform your homelessness prevention strategies and how you would go about tackling homelessness. And
the two groups that you might want to that perhaps fill into this not in the data set piece. One is households that were perhaps outside of Exeter, have moved in and are struggling immediately and presenting as homeless. The other group are those that perhaps weren't considered low income, but something has happened to end their tenancy. And we see a lot of perhaps private sector tenancies ending, but because rents have increased so much, it can be difficult for them to find work. And I've just drilled down to understand a bit more about who these not in the data set households are. So a few of them have high barriers to work. We can see them by tenure, and it will be interesting to see. I'll just emphasize this is all live and I'm answering my own questions here at the moment, but you could look back at these and perhaps talk to them about, were they in the private renter sector before? Could we have worked with them earlier? Did they present earlier on to the council? So quite a lot of detail there on cases. I just wanted to flick back here and perhaps run through a few questions, if I may. Before I do that, I wanted to say a huge thanks to all of the clients that we're working with here, and a huge thanks as well to Terran for running through that demonstration, but also for really, when Terran came on board, he was tasked as a final year master's student to create powerful visualizations for the analytics that we were doing, and really has been responsible for the development of the dashboard as a service, and continues to be. So kind of, I think when you joined, I think we had one client to have 8 on board now, and growing month on month. That's a huge achievement. So I just wanted to sort of recognize that publicly, and then take a few questions. So Janet, why don't you sort of run through the questions while you're sort of filtering the questions that have come through, and perhaps any more that are coming through. I had 2 more for Chris, if I may take the liberty of being a chair. One was, Chris, I remember when I came and presented to you, there were about 14 people around that table, quite a lot in other departments, and it'd be good. Could you talk a bit about the other departments that the use cases for the other departments as well?
Yeah, I think initially we saw the usefulness around the customer service offer and dealing with presenting customers in the service centre, as well as obviously benefits and welfare and discretionary funds, but also around debt recovery. So we're a stockholding authority. We have 5,000 odd council tenants and temporary accommodation tenants. So obviously usefulness there around collecting that debt, council tax debt, housing benefit overpayment and so on. But sort of wider than that as well, also the support that we provide to those tenants, so through housing, estate services and so on. And I think we're now just starting to look at, as you just ran through there, some of the usefulness that we can find around homelessness on the HRA. I think there's going to be quite a lot of data that they can access through the dashboard. Obviously, it all starts with housing benefit data. So if they're not in the housing benefit caseload, then we don't know about them. But certainly in temporary accommodation, that represents an awful lot of the demand. So as a district authority, that probably covers off the main services that we'd use it for.
If I may jump in here, because that's a very nice segue into a question that has come through. Sorry, Devon, that has come through from one of the attendees today. And the question is, can this dashboard be used on a larger scale, or would it be more beneficial for smaller councils? This particular person is from a large council who has a large number of customers renting from us. Any thoughts there, Chris, on district versus unitary or county?
Yeah, I guess at a unitary level or county level, then the responsibilities are different and the services that are offered are different. So, yeah, certainly if we're finding usefulness from it at our smaller scale, I can only imagine that would be greater if you're involved in social services, health, education, and so on.
Yeah, and I would just second that by saying I think the economies of scale of pulling all the information together are that much greater for a unitary authority. And again, because those responsibilities are broader, the potential teams that might want to use it, for example, employment and skills, which or economic development teams that have that responsibility, are groups that might find a lot of value in it too.
Okay,
Janet, any?
Yeah, I've got loads of questions. So apologies to everybody that has sent questions in. I don't think we're going to have time to go through them all, but I do commit to getting answers to you. So let me just pick a few out. I think a question here for well, anybody on the panel. How does the dashboard work for authorities without arrears data who do not have their own housing stock?
Can I just quickly mention there? I think. One of the things that we're missing off our dashboard at the moment, which is going to give us a lot more information, will be council tax arrears data, and we're struggling with the technical route to get that data out. But that's only going to add to the usefulness. I think it's going to bring in a lot more customers.
Yeah,
and that's an interesting point about linking data sets, Devon, I suppose.
Devon?
With regards to the additional data sets, so the core data sets are the housing benefit and council tax support. And we work with these additional data sets that include council tax arrears, rent arrears, support in the form of discretionary housing payment, exceptional hardship payments, and we even look at housing benefit overpayments. So while the core data sets are essential, these add-on data sets are not essential, but I believe if the more that we have, the more value that it can add. And because you would be layering on all these data sets on top of each other. But I mean, I think it would still show valuable information if we are at least able to get support information on that.
And we're also starting to talk to other departments and councils that perhaps have their own broader databases. What's interesting is sometimes you find larger councils with analytics teams who again, there's always that question of should we be doing this ourselves? And I think the value that policy and practice adds is understanding benefits and these data sets in particular, which again, from a technical perspective, is possible to do whatever you want, but knowing what's useful to the service leads and having that all in one place is very powerful too. And then being able to link that into other data sets. So one council we're speaking to, for example, said, yeah, we've had this data for a long time. We just don't know what to do with it because Sheeby in itself is 342 columns, pretty complex information. So trying to figure out what's useful within it and squeezing as much value out of it as possible is sometimes helpful to have specialists focus on.
Excellent. I'm aware of the time here, so I'm just going to squeeze this last question in, if I may, before we have to finish up. But this is a question for Chris, and this may be a bit specific. Chris, if you want to take the answer offline, I appreciate that as well. But are you working with the Devon Trailblazer team to try and identify households threatened with homelessness? If so, do you know whether that team is doing the same kind of modelling across the rest of Devon? I suppose the question there is about working with a neighbouring authority, as well as specifics.
Yeah, that's not something I'm aware of. I'm not involved in the housing advice homelessness team, so I'm not sure whether that is something that's going on. But certainly internally, we're starting to have those conversations with our housing team. So if they're involved in that group, then can feed into it. Well,
this particular person has given a name, so I'll be able to pass that on to you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. I think I'm going to, like I say, I'm going to draw a close to the questions there because we are out of time. In fact, we're a little bit over time, but just very briefly, in terms of next steps, we have in the panel on the right-hand side, you may well see that there are 2 downloads for you to take away from today's webinar. One is our leaflet, just giving a little bit more background about the dashboard and the service that we've just talked through today. And there's also the download of the Universal Credit Roadmap as well. So do take a minute just to download those 2 handouts for you. And also, when we finish the webinar, there will be a very short survey. I think there's about 5 questions in the survey. We'd love your feedback. We always want to improve our webinars and keep them pacey and all that good stuff. And there's an opportunity for you to ask further questions or indeed ask for clarification there. You can put your hand up and say if you want to have another look at the dashboard yourself in your own time. And also you can ask about further information about the homelessness work we've talked about, predictive analytics. And also, I know Devon very briefly touched on the software there. If you want to know more about the software, stick that in the survey as well. Okay, so that should keep you occupied. So it just goes over to maybe Devon, you would like to do the thanks at the end of the session.
Yeah, I mean, genuinely, Chris, a huge thanks. It's been a pleasure working with Exeter. We spoke yesterday in preparation for this call about things about how you might use the dashboard in the future. And one of the things we're going to be doing is setting up a user group for our clients. So probably around March time, having you and others across other councils talk a bit about not just, well, partly how best to make the most of the data you've got, also where you want to take that, which can help inform how we develop our services in the future. And again, particularly at this earlier stage of landing it into lots of new clients, we're learning more and more about how best to refine those use cases further. And again, these are things that you can take on and do yourself. But what we find is councils really appreciate just having the answers in front of them. Hopefully, we can answer more and more questions for them over time. Chris, I wanted to give you the last word actually, and see if there's anything you wanted to say to the audience.
Yeah. Can I just take the opportunity to say a big thank you to Terry for all the work he's put into developing the dashboard. It is an incredibly useful tool, and I'm finding that I'm only just scratching the surface of its usefulness. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Appreciate it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And Devon's contact details, Chris's contact details there on the screen, and you can reach us there, the General Policy and Practice contact details there. Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. I shall close up the webinar now. Thanks very much for your time. It's been great to have you on board, and take care, and we'll chat to you soon. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye.